Welcome to the Future Generations Podcast, providing you with the world-changing content necessary to inspire you, your family, and our planet to a life of optimal health potential. We'll help you make the choices that powerfully influence the lives you bring into this world. It's time to strengthen our resolve to do better now and for our future generations with your host, Dr. Stanton Hom.
Welcome to another episode of the Future Generations Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Stanton Hom. I have with me the most special guest that we've ever had on this podcast, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Sir, you have been a beacon for human freedom, for our listeners, for our platform. You blessed us with your presence in a big way 2 Decembers ago at Heart of Freedom 3. I'd love to have some questions as a result of what you spoke there, but most importantly, I wanted to congratulate you on your presidential candidacy. It's the single most exciting thing I've seen amplify over the last 3 years, and I'd love to welcome you to the Future Generation Podcast.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hom. I'm very, very happy to be here.
Sir, I've watched several of your interviews so far, and there are several things that I wanted to talk about, especially having read American Values, especially having a good background of what I believe is one of those, if there is a flagship family for America, and if there is a legacy family, it is a Kennedy family. And I would love for you to share a little bit of background on the inspiration, what's catalyzed you into a presidential candidacy.
Well, I'm running because I saw things happening to my country and to my political party that just seemed unacceptable, like that we're on the wrong path. And I felt like I was in a unique position to maybe help the country do a course correction. I don't like, of course, I differed fiercely with the COVID policies, which were instead of having a public health response to a public health crisis, we had this kind of militarized and monetized response that made hundreds of billions for pharmaceutical companies. But, we ended up with the highest body count of any country in the world from COVID. We have 16% of the COVID deaths, and yet we only have 4.2% of the global population. And so clearly the countermeasures that we implemented in this country were the worst in the world. And that was clear from the beginning. The COVID policies accelerated a very bad trajectory that has been occurring in this country for many years, which is not only the morphing of our country into a surveillance state, but this huge shift in wealth during the COVID crisis. The lockdowns created a new billionaire every day.
Wow.
There was 500 new billionaires created. And the Oxfam report that just came out showed that the billionaires who were billionaires prior to the pandemic increased their wealth by 30%. Overall, there was a $4 trillion shift in wealth from the middle class in this country to the super rich. And, we're turning this country into this very, very dangerous wealth profile where you have these huge concentrations of wealth above and then this widespread poverty below. In 1970, 62% of the wealth of the salaries in this country went to the middle class. Today, that's 42%. And, that's why virtually everybody, even people who are well off, who are kind of upper middle class, feel this insecurity, and debt has become a part of our daily lives. And we spent overall $16 trillion on the pandemic. That's what Lawrence Summers' report shows to the IMF and to Harvard. And you add to that the cost of the wars, the foreign wars that we've been in since Iraq, which is 8.1 trillion, for which we've gotten nothing good in return, only bad things. Iraq is now worse off than we found it. we killed more Iraqis. We killed almost 1 million Iraqis, many more than Saddam Hussein ever killed. That country is now incoherent as a nation. It's a war between Sunni and Shia death squads. We've pushed Iraq into the gravitational pull, basically a proxy state of Iran, which is exactly what we were trying to prevent for 40 years. We created ISIS. We drove 2 million refugees into Europe from the Middle East, which has destabilized Europe for a generation, democracy in Europe. So what we got out for that 8 trillion was worse than nothing. So that's a total of 24 trillion that we spent on wars and on COVID, and then you add to that the bank bailouts, and you can understand why we don't have a middle class left in the United States of America, and you can't have democracy very long without a middle class. I didn't like the COVID policies. I don't like the censorship, the attack, the assault we saw on civil liberties and constitutional rights. I don't like the fact that the Democratic Party has become the party of war, the party of fear, the party of pharma. And I felt like I had a unique voice to be able to protest against those trends and to explain to the American people where our country's gone wrong, and to recall it back to those, to summons it back to those values. When the Democratic Party were Kennedy Democrats, when they were FDR Democrats, when they were Democrats who were aligned with traditional values.
So we definitely align on virtually everything that you just shared. Before we move on, I'd love to talk more about specifically the term Kennedy Democrat. I think it's a powerful distinction. Just knowing how polarized the country has become, and just how you've said very clearly and unabashedly that the Democratic Party has become like the party of pharma and the party of censorship and the party of so many things that our country just doesn't represent. How do you aim to tackle this censorship? I don't think there's been one individual that's been targeted more, but there have been millions of us that have, whether it's something as simple as shadow banning or deplatforming, or just all the different aspects that we've seen. How do you aim to tackle that?
Well, as president, I will end it. The government shouldn't be participating in censorship. It's a violation of the First Amendment, and I will, send a memo on day one and sign an executive order telling all the departments of government that they're not to participate in propagandizing the American people or in censoring the American people, whether even, that they're not allowed to censor dissent, that's something that will no longer be tolerated in our government. So, that will be number one on the first day. And I think that's the least a difficult problem to solve.
Really? How do you take on the companies, the tech giants that have literally enveloped the entire planet?
The tech giants are allowed to deplatform you if they don't like what you're saying, and it's a different question. I mean, that's a private publisher. So what they do is not, does not violate the First Amendment. It violates the First Amendment when the government is participating in it, when they're government officials telling them to do that and they're obeying. And that's what we had here. We had, the White House and Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, those social media companies. We now know from the Twitter files had provided portals for the FBI and the CIA to go in and remove posts and to censor posts and to censor individuals and remove them from the platform. And that is very, very dangerous. When you have the Central Intelligence Agency censoring political dissent in our country, that's when we've really crossed the line. So, the other question that you raised is the power of these technology companies, that they just, they wield now this really awesome power that's made them more powerful than most nation states. And how do you bring that power under control? And that's going to be an interesting challenge, and it's something that I really look forward to grappling with that about what do we do as a nation to make sure that uh, that we don't that these large aggregations of power that we're seeing do not damage our country or our democracy or the free flow of information, etc.
At Heart of Freedom 3, you charge the audience to know three things. The first was specifically when dealing with totalitarianism. You said any power they take away, they'll never get back without mass resistance.
Any power the government takes, it will not voluntarily give back without a confrontation.
The second,
today, when they've ended the lockdown, but they didn't retract their capacity to impose another lockdown or to impose masking or vaccine mandates or social distancing or all the other things that we now know didn't work. And what we need is some permanent rules that say you can't ever do that again. That's one of the things I will do as well. I'll make sure that this never happens again.
You mentioned two other things. One was that every power they take, they will abuse to the maximum ability, and the last one was that nobody in history complies their way out of totalitarianism. My question for you is: I feel a level of distrust from the American people in all government at this point, especially the office of the president. How do you? I love the fact that it's very clear. We'll just ensure it never happens again. But the restoring of the trust, I think, is a huge factor that I've seen in your messaging, in every speech, in every interview, even in the points that you put on Team Kennedy's website. There's a higher level of communication, a higher value set. But I'd love for you to share a little bit about how you.
I mean, the way that you restore trust is by start becoming trustworthy. You start telling the truth, not only about little things, but also, we need science that actually is, right now the science is all, the scientific establishment has given science a bad name during the pandemic. And what we need is to restore trust to science, restore trust to NIH. We need to get the money out of the pharmaceutical money out of NIH. NIH should not be accepting royalties for pharmaceutical drugs. CDC should not be marketing products for vaccine companies or for other companies, and FDA should not be getting half of its budget from pharmaceutical companies. That has to end. And then we need to go back. I'm going to address the issue of the scientific journals, which are enormously, they're just cesspools of corruption right now. The New England Journal of Medicine, even, Marcia Angel, who is the editor of New England Journal of Medicine, Richard Horton, who's the editor of Lancet, have acknowledged that they have become vessels for pharmaceutical propaganda, that you can no longer trust the science that is in their publications, and yet most doctors still do. So they become, these implements of deception, and we need to incentivize for those. We need to incentivize good behavior from the journals, and we need to punish bad behavior. And if that means bringing racketeering cases, having my Justice Department bring racketeering cases against the major journals for collaborating with the pharmaceutical industry to deceive the American public and to injure the American public, my Justice Department will do that. And as soon as I appoint an attorney general, that's one of the first tasks that I will assign them. So we need to get the pharmaceutical industry money out of the regulatory agencies, and we need to uncapture them. We need to release them from the control by pharmaceutical companies.
How do you do that, Bobby?
Well, that I've actually spent the last 40 years thinking about that and planning ways to unravel the control of those agencies. And most of the people who work for those agencies, Dr. Hahn, are very patriotic and they're good public servants and they're there because of an idealism. So they don't want to be doing pharmaceutical industry bidding. But unfortunately, the people who tend to rise to top in those bureaucracies and dominate the departments, the branches, the divisions, they are people who in the past have been willing to carry water for the industry that they're supposed to be regulating. And that corruption then has gone from the top down and perverted so that these agencies are no longer public health agencies. They're really drug promotion and pharmaceutical reps. And we need to end that. And part of that is, the old mantra that policy is personnel. You change the people in those agencies, you get rid of the people who have corrupted those agencies. And in most cases, I know who they are. I know their names, not only at FDA, CDC, and NIH, but at USDA, the Department of Agriculture, which has sold its soul to the factory farm and processed food industries and the big industrial farming. That agency was created to protect the small independent family farmer who was so important to American democracy, to food production, to our culture, to our values. And that agency has adopted rules and regulations that have essentially destroyed the family farmer in this country. EPA, when we sued EPA, when we sued Monsanto, we uncovered email traffic that showed that the head of the pesticide division, Jess Rowland, many years was actually secretly working for Monsanto. He was not working for the American people. He was working for, a pesticide and chemical company, and he was killing studies for them, and he was ghostwriting studies that were just big lies to the American people. And so people like that have to be removed. And we need to put in people who are genuinely devoted to public health and to protecting the environment and making our railroads run without going off the tracks and dumping toxics, destroying Columbiana County and in Ohio and East Palestine or wherever. We need age. We can do it. We can unravel the corruption in these agencies, and I have to say this, Dr. Hunt. What I've seen is many people running for office and planning and saying we're going to drain the swamp. But they get into the office, like whether it's President Trump or President Biden, let's take them for examples. They get into office and they're confronted with these giant bureaucracies, and it's very intimidating because if you start messing with the wrong people in them, they can commit civil disobediences, they can make the lights go out, they can, bad things can happen that can embarrass a president. The presidents usually, they don't want to go into the weeds and they don't understand how these bureaucracies work or how to reform them. So they usually bring in somebody who is safe to run that agency. And that usually means somebody who's from the industry. President Trump promised to fix, HHS and the vaccine program. He actually asked me to run a vaccine safety commission. But when that word got out and there was press about it, Pfizer made $1 million contribution to President Trump. And President Trump then appointed basically two handpicked guys, Alex Azar to run HHS and Scott Gottlieb to run FDA. Scott Gottlieb was a business partner of Pfizer. And, and he came in to run FDA. He ushered through the approval of Pfizer's, products of their vaccines and made them $88 billion. And then he left the agency to go back to Pfizer's board and profiteer on, the work that he had done. He was not working for the American public. He was working for Pfizer, although we were paying him. And unfortunately, that's true in most of these agencies. President President Biden, when he came into office, he appointed Pete Buttigieg, who is very friendly with my family. My kids worked in his election, but he brought them in there to run DOT. And I have nothing against Pete Buttigieg, but I know he didn't spend like the last 20 years of his life thinking about how do I fix DOT and how do I make sure that the railroads are not corrupting the agency, that the airlines are not corrupting it. And I can't wait to go in there and fix that. That's not the approach that he has. There were many, many problems with the railroads that we now know that almost certainly contributed to the wreck in East Palestine. They didn't have the hot boxes that were supposed to tell them that. And we have very good technology that tells you that can tell an engineer when one of the wheels is heating up. But on that train, that didn't happen. That wheel was burning and the whole car was burning for 20 miles before they derailed in East Palestine. And the engineer should have known that and should have been able to shut off the train. The brake systems on those trains were designed and first installed during the Civil War. We now have really good hydraulic brake systems and automatic brake systems that are much, much better. And yet, because they will cost the railroad a few dollars, the railroads have been reluctant to install them. There's also rail cars, what they call the DOT 117 cars, that if they do derail, will not have the kind of problems that with the vinyl chloride load that these cars did, with leaking valves and only a single shell, and yet the railroads have agreed to install them, but not they've delayed it. They've said we're not going to do that, I think, till 2030 or something. So the question is why? And why, if I was DOT commissioner, I'd come in and say, no, we got to do these today. Let's repromulgate these regulations, and we got to protect the public. That's my job, protecting the public from the industry. And I would come in and not let anything get in my way. But I don't think, most of the people who come in to run these agencies are people who can go on the morning talk shows and who can, push the president's agenda and who can act as surrogates and campaigners for him. And they're not really interested in coming in and fixing the whole place. And I'm not blaming Mayor Pete. I'm just saying that I don't believe that was his intention when he joined DOT.
Bobby, was going back to what you said about President Trump, because I have some colleagues who are devout followers, but they did say, like, under their breath, like he took money from pharma. And so after the Vaccine Safety Commission basically was announced, there was a reactionary donation from Pfizer specifically. And
or his inaugural parties.
Wow.
So, and they can do that. The president is under pressure to give these great inaugural parties, and he has to go to industry. And of course, when Pfizer gives you $1 million, they're not doing that out of a patriotic impulse.
Right.
They're not doing it out of because they love humanity. They're doing it because they expect to get something in return. And by the way, that's the rule. That's the law. That's the way corporations are setting up. Corporations can't turn themselves into charities, and they can't turn themselves into, political action committees for when they spend money. If they're spending money in ways that are not calculated to increase shareholder value or increase profit-taking or revenues, any of their shareholders can sue them. And they'll win that lawsuit for wasting corporate assets. The CEO of a company is not allowed to start just giving corporate assets away unless there's a benefit coming back, some kind of reciprocity. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's the way we set them up. But what it means is they should not be running our government. because they're not, when they give money to public officials, they're not doing it out of, out of a philanthropic impulses. They're doing it because they want something in return. They want to buy, they want to purchase access, and they want to purchase action from the government that is often detrimental to the public interest. And that's why it's important to keep corporate money out of government.
I mean,
It's,
I don't.
it's a system of legalized bribery.
Yeah, and I don't think anybody knows that revolving door. I remember it was, I think it was 2018 California Jam, that amazing conference in Orange County where you spoke, Dell spoke, and you basically did a full presentation on how you're postured to take down Monsanto. This is pre, obviously, taking them down. And I believe you asked the audience for $250,000 to hire a lawyer. I think we raised $500,000 as an audience for you, and
Yeah, that was an amazing display of, of generosity. I think I raised $500,000 from the chiropractors.
But it was months. It was months, if not weeks, where the lawsuits came and were won, and then the purchase of Monsanto by Bayer. I don't know the numbers exactly, but I believe the purchase was for $60 billion, and then their stock plummets. Bayer's essentially after the lawsuits, the same amount. And
Yeah.
I think that's a vote to who you are, and a very pragmatic way where this monstrosity of a corporation like Monsanto that has a stranglehold. I mean, being in California where we can't even legislate to label GMO products, and then all of a sudden the entire company just starts to plummet in the wake of lawsuits from you. I think it's phenomenal.
First, when we were still picking a jury up in San Francisco at the time that Bayer bought Monsanto. For Monsanto, it was one of the greatest deals in history because they were about to, sink under the ocean, and they got somebody to purchase them, a German company to purchase them at full value. So the board got paid off. They got all collected their, stock value and dividends, and then they ran like hell to get out of the splatter zone as quickly as possible. And Bayer got left hanging, holding the bag, and Bayer's shareholders, they deserve compensation because we were picking a jury. Anybody could have gone in and said, well, wait a minute, before we buy you, let's see how this case goes. And then, we won, I think, 189 million, as I recall, during the first trial. The second trial, we won like 87 million. And then the third trial, we won 2.2 billion. We asked the jury for $1 billion, and they gave us $1 billion. There were two clients. It was a couple who had both gotten non-Hodgkin's lymphoma at the same time. Their dog had gotten it because he did the gardening with them. And the dog died, a Labrador Retriever, and the two of them all got it. They all got it at the same time. And they had not handled any other chemicals because they believed Monsanto when it said that this was the one weed killer that was safe. And they said, they said it was safe as aspirin. You could drink it. And they had pictures of people applying it, wearing their shorts and no shirt. And so a lot of people, the people we mainly represented on these cases were home gardeners. We didn't have agricultural workers because you couldn't isolate the impacts of Monsanto on agricultural workers. Agricultural workers, first of all, they do use, full moon suits. And so they're protected, but also they're dealing with all kinds of pesticides. It could be atrazine, neonicotinoid pesticides, et cetera. And so it's much harder in court to say, okay, your tumors came from Roundup and glyphosate and not from atrazine. So we ended up representing mainly home gardeners who were risk averse. They never handled any other chemicals because they were scared of them. But they believed Monsanto's representations about Roundup. And so they were willing to handle Roundup. And little did they know that that was causing the cancers as well. And so this couple, we asked for $1 billion. We actually had a big argument the night before because the lead attorney, Brent Wisner, who was going to give the closing argument, he said, we all wanted him to ask for 300 million because you don't want to alienate the jury by asking too much. And Brent said, no, I really trust this jury. I feel, an energy from them. And he asked for $1 billion, and they came back with 2.2 billion. They gave $1 billion to 1.1 billion to each of the couples, and that got rolled back. Of course, the court, wouldn't let them keep it. But anyway, we ended up after that third one, we ended up settling the entire suit for. By then, there were like 40,000 clients for 13 billion. At the price of Bayer had purchased Monsanto while we were picking the jury on the first case for $63 billion. And then when we won those cases, their share price dropped by 63 billion. So it basically erased the entire value of Monsanto. And, I'd been fighting that company my whole life. So that was kind of gratifying to me. I started out when I was a kid, I met Rachel Carson. At that time, my uncle was defending her. Rachel Carson was under attack by Monsanto. They had this. It was like the tobacco industry, but they invented the sort of tobacco, the reaction. The tobacco counteroffensive really was invented by Monsanto, and they went after Rachel Carson. They tried to destroy her. They in their public descriptions of her, they would call her a spinster, which was the contemporary euphemism for lesbian. So they were just trying to degrade her in every way. And she was dying of cancer at that time and couldn't really defend herself. But my uncle, I'm very proud, John Kennedy, who was then president, came to her aid, and he appointed Jerome Wisner and a group of scientists from all over the world to review Silent Spring, her book, and to see whether, who was right. Was she right, or was Monsanto, which was saying it was all lies, were they right? And that commission came back after 6 or 8 months and said, everything in it is correct. And Rachel Carson knew that she was going to come under attack, so she had given 3 references for every fact in the book, every factual assertion. So she was very, very careful, very, very rigorous. And my uncle ended up, vindicating her just before she died. And then my uncle had done a tour on the environment just before he died, did a national tour on the environment, and ended up sowed the seeds for Earth Day in 1970, which came 7 years after his death. And that was the biggest public demonstration in American history. 20 million people came out onto the street, the largest public demonstration ever, and demanding that our leadership return to the American people the ancient environmental rights that had been stolen from our citizens over the previous 80 years. And the reaction to Earth Day terrified the political establishment. Republicans and Democrats got together. Nixon was president then. He created EPA, a Republican. He signed the Clean Air Act, signed the Clean Water Act. And over the next 11 years, Republicans and Democrats got together and we passed 28 major environmental statutes. And that was really that laid the groundwork for the kind of work that I do that allowed us to clean up the Hudson and so many other rivers, et cetera.
Bobby, speaking about your uncle, I've heard you say on previous interviews that there's no real popularity contest for American presidents around the world. However, the number of statues, the number of streets named after, the number of institutions go to show just the impact. And then when your campaign came out with the term Kennedy Democrat, I don't know if that's a new term or an old term, but what I know is that it shifted a perspective in a lot of my listeners' hearts, and also just in general my own mind, on how it's different. And I'd love for you to share a little bit about that.
Well, my uncle, was asked by his best friend, Ben Bradley, one of his best friends, Ben Bradley, who was the publisher of the Washington Post, what do you want on your gravestone? And my uncle said very quickly, he kept the peace. And he said the primary job of the president of the United States is to keep the country out of war. And, right before he was elected in January 17th of 1961, that was my birthday. I was 7 years old. The outgoing president, Dwight Eisenhower, gave this famous speech, which is now should be regarded as the most important speech in American history, where he warned Americans against the emergence of a military-industrial complex that would devour and destroy American democracy, that would turn us into an imperium abroad and a surveillance state at home. And my uncle, when he came into office 2 months in, he did the Bay of Pigs. He was very, very reluctant to allow the Cubans to go invade Cuba. I think there were 1,200 of them in the Bay of Pigs in the brigade. And he just thought it was wrong that America, this huge nation, should be, picking on a little country, even if they had a system of government we didn't like. At that time, the Russians weren't there. Oh, it was really just their choice, their domestic choice, that they wanted to experiment with Marxism. And my uncle felt like, okay, that's not a choice we like, but it's their choice. And, they ought to be able to make their own choices about their own governments, where they are. And it's not our business. It's up to them. And he didn't want the U.S. used as a base for an invasion. But and in the end, he refused to allow the Navy to transport the troops, and they had to go to United Fruit Company. The whole thing was a CIA enterprise, and the head of the CIA was Allen Dulles. And before joining the CIA, he had been a lawyer for Sullivan Cromwell, and one of his clients was United Fruit. So that, he did these coups in countries where, like in Guatemala, when they nationalized United Fruit, Dulles went in and overthrew the new president, Jacob Arbenz, who was this incredible humanitarian, a devotee of democracy. He, in fact, had nationalized his own property because he wanted to nationalize property that was not being used, that was being underutilized. And United Fruit was down there, and they owned 90% of the land in Guatemala, and they were keeping 85% of that untilled and barren, in order to lower the supply of bananas, to raise the price, and to lower the price of labor. And Jacob Arbenz came in and said, no, there were so many poor people, landless peasants in this country, and let's distribute the land among them and let them grow the fruit and and then sell it. And the United Fruit complained to Allen Dulles, and as I said, Arbenz nationalized his own property. And what happened is interesting because United Fruit owned all the land basically in Guatemala, but they claimed the land was only worth, I think, $16 million, and that's what they were paying taxes on forever. And so Arbenz said, look, we're going to give you the price of the land. We're going to give you the $16 million. So don't worry about it. You're not losing anything. And they said, oh, well, that was a mistake. It's actually worth $1 billion.
Wow.
And he said, well, you've been claiming it was 16 million for all these years so that you could pay low taxes on it. Now you're claiming that you're not, we can't let you do that. And so they instead went to Dulles and complained, and Dulles had represented them before joining the CIA, and he went in and overthrew Arbenz. And the same thing happened in Cuba, and my uncle wouldn't let the Navy transport him, so they provided United Fruit owned most of the sugarcane in Cuba. And so they went in there and invaded, and then the CIA, Richard Bissell, Allen Dulles, and Charles Cabal, who are the top three guys at the CIA. My uncle said, how can 1,200 men overthrow Castro? He's an army of 200,000 men, well trained. And they said he's so unpopular that as soon as these men land, the army is going to turn on Castro and there's going to be a public uprising all over Cuba. And my uncle was very skeptical, but they guaranteed him that. And in the middle of the day, when those men were getting killed on the beach, and the CIA came back to him and said, "You need to send in the Navy and an aircraft and bomb and take over, invade, make it a U.S. invasion." My uncle said no, and he walked out of that meeting and he said, "I want to take the CIA and splinter it into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds." He realized they'd been lying to him and that the function of the CIA had devolved into providing America, the military industrial complex of which Eisenhower had warned us, with a constant pipeline of new war to enrich military contractors and expand the power of the brass and the intelligence apparatus. So after that, his next 3 years in office were just a constant war with his own military advisors to keep the country out of war. He kept them out of Laos, and they considered him a traitor for that. And he kept them. He never sent combat troops to Vietnam. So they wanted 250,000 combat troops, and he said, "We'll send advisors to advise the Vietnamese governments how to protect itself, but we're not going to send fighting people. We're not going to have American dying." And he learned just before his death that 75 special forces had died over there, and he said, "I want them all home." And he signed a national security order ordering all 16,000 troops home by December of 65, with the first 1,000 coming home in in December of 63. And he was then killed, I think, 2 weeks later. And as soon as he was killed, Johnson remanded that order and then, made it an American war, sent 250,000 men, ultimately 500,000 men over. And 56,000 of them, including my cousin George Skakel, who died on the Tet Offensive, would never come home. And my father then ran against the military industrial complex in the war in Vietnam in 68. He was killed during that campaign. And, the Democratic Party was still the party of peace, even, through Carter. And then gradually we started, adopting these kind of neocon values that, and we're the party of war and the neocons. The same people who did the war in Iraq during the Bush administration are now in the Biden administration doing the war in Ukraine. And the war in Ukraine, we were sold that it was a humanitarian war and that it was, humanitarian help. But it turns out that's not what they were up to. President Biden has said our purpose of that war is regime change of Vladimir Putin, and his defense secretary, Lloyd Austin, said that the reason we're there is to exhaust the Russian army and degrade it so they can't carry on battles anywhere else in the world. Well, that's the opposite of a humanitarian mission. That's a mission that means it's a war of attrition. And that's what's happened. We've killed that agenda. We've killed 300,000 Ukrainian kids. That the flower of Ukrainian youth that has been delivered into this abattoir of death, where they're being killed 7-1 against Russians. There's 30,000 to 100,000 Russians who died, which should not give us any cause for joy. And the Russians can't afford to lose this war, and they're not going to lose it.
Bobby,
anyway, my purpose is to end the war, to bring our troops home. We have 800 bases around the world, and we are hollowing out the middle class in this country. That war right now has cost us $113 billion. The entire budget for CDC is $12 billion a year. NIH or EPA's budget is about $12 billion. And, we have 57% of Americans could not put their hands on $1,000 if they come into an emergency. We cannot afford these endless wars. They're killing us. 16 trillion for COVID lockdowns, 8 trillion for wars. And, Americans, and at the same time, last month, they cut 30 million Americans, they cut their food stamps by 90%. And all the wars, we don't have money for these wars, so they print the money, and that caused inflation. So the price of food's gone up 76%. And we're cutting food stamps to Americans and Medicaid to 15 million the same month, and bailing out with $300 billion, the Silicon Valley Bank. This makes no sense. We're penalizing the poor and we're rewarding the rich. And this country's become this kind of cushy socialism for the rich and this brutal, barbaric, merciless capitalism for the middle class and poor in this country. And we got to bring that to an end.
Bobby, I'm a West Point grad. I lost some friends in Iraq, and it's only appropriate for us to end this conversation that in 2 weeks' time, Memorial Day weekend, we will have you out here in San Diego for your first public live event since the announcement. I don't think I've seen something more exciting than your announcement for presidency in Boston. My team got to go out with your team out there. And this event, we're looking to, as we have for the last 3 years, just drop a tsunami wave of purpose, of conviction, of inspiration, of hope for not only our county, but as a representation of what we can actually inspire in the nation. And I'd love for you to share a little bit about what you're feeling as far as coming out here to San Diego.
I'm very, very excited to see you and all of my friends in San Diego, and I look forward to seeing you there.
The last question, if I can ask one more. I've studied your family quite a bit, and Rose Kennedy is known to have a deep sense of purpose to raise world leaders, and I know that a lot of our audience are parents. They have been watching the tyranny blanket not only our country but the world. And I'm curious if there's something that you can share with our audience that can inspire in them a sense of hope and possibility for their kids specifically, in terms of how we can inspire the same thing that your family's inspired in your family tree in theirs.
Well, all I'll say is that my primary objective when I get into the White House is going to be ending the childhood chronic disease epidemic. And, right now, when I was a kid, 6% of Americans had chronic disease. Today, as of 2006, and it's probably more today, 54% of kids have chronic disease. And, we're the sickest country in the world. The richest country, we pay more for healthcare than anybody in the world, and we have the worst health outcomes, and we have the sickest population, and that's unacceptable. And it's going to destroy us as a nation. We have the cost of caring for children with autism. People with autism by 2030 is going to go up to $1 trillion a year. It's going to bankrupt us. We spend $4.3 trillion on our healthcare system, and 80% of that is going to chronic disease. If we want to save money from healthcare, we need to obliterate chronic disease, and that's what I'm going to do as president. I'm going to root out the causes, eliminate them, and make a healthy generation of American children.
Thank you, Bobby. That's been our shared mission for my entire career. I'm grateful for the opportunity to spend this time with you. I'm excited to see you in 2 weeks, and I just know this episode, but also our event in 2 weeks is just going to echo into this American population in a very powerful way. I'm very grateful.
Thank you very much, John.
We appreciate you joining us for this episode of the Future Generations Podcast. Remember to rate, review, and subscribe on iTunes and Spotify. For more resources based on today's episode, as well as more ways to inspire a brighter future for you and your family, visit us at thefuturegen.com. That's all available exclusively on thefuturegen.com.